which is a conversation on Donald Judd's paintings. We're here at the exhibition at Gagosian in Chelsea, New York, and it's my pleasure to introduce our three speakers tonight: Eileen Costello, Marta Kuzma, and Caitlin Murray. Eileen Costello is an art historian and an editor. Among her many projects and publications, she was the editor for the Jasper Johns Catalog Raisonné of Drawings, as well as the online Catalog Raisonné of Arshile Gorky. She is currently working alongside Yves Bois on the Catalog Raisonné for Ellsworth Kelly of paintings, reliefs, and sculptures. Marta Kuzma is professor of art at the Yale School of Art, where she was previously dean, the first female dean in the school's history. Prior to that, she was chancellor at the Royal Academy of Art in Stockholm. And Caitlin Murray is the director of archives and programming at Judd Foundation. Murray is the co-editor of Donald Judd Writings and Donald Judd Interviews. And with that, I'll turn it over to Caitlin.
Thank you, Wyatt. I'm thrilled to be here this evening with Eileen and Marta to discuss the exhibition Donald Judd Paintings, 1959 to 1961. This exhibition consists of 15 paintings, many of which have only been exhibited once or twice previously. I'd like to take a moment to view the exhibition and to share a few words from the poet Eileen Miles, who wrote about Judd's paintings in a 2018 catalog for ICA Miami. So if we could begin with a few images of the installation to get a sense of their size and scale and of the paintings and their relationship to one another. Next, I'd like to look at reference image number 7, a painting by Judd from 1961. As Miles wrote, it's fairly tie-dyed, the surface puckers, there's a red stripe inside the white stripe that for a while is taped on. He's trying to add more thing to it. Plus the red stripe inside the white feels like inserting an institution inside of a painting. Rather than geometry, it's emo, it's a desperate measure. How old is Judd at this point, 33? The age at which in spiritual circles they say a guy kicks the frame. Release from temptation, a numerologist told me. The guy's got 4 more years of reviewing. These paintings are like archways to the invisible. They're all about limitation and then pushing against that. And some, of course, are quite beautiful. So thank you for joining me this evening, Marta and Eileen. It's such a pleasure.
It's nice to be here.
Because Eileen Miles brings in Judd's age of 33 when he's making many of the paintings that we'll be discussing this evening, I wanted to begin with some biographical context, and I was hoping that you guys could share what you think are some of the most salient points from what's going on with Judd in the previous decade, where he's studying and what he's reviewing as an art critic.
Sure, I'll address that. So I think it's really important to set the stage for these paintings. I think so many people are unfamiliar with them and where did these come from. So yes, just to give some biographical background. So 1948 to 1953, Judd is at the Art Students League. In 1953, that's the year that he gets his undergrad Bachelor of Science from Columbia University in philosophy. 1953 is also the year that he moves to New York. He'd been living in his parents' home in New Jersey. 57 is when he begins graduate work in art history at Columbia, and while he completed the coursework in the fall of 1961, he never fulfilled the requirements for the doctorate. In 1959, he starts writing art reviews, first for Art News magazine for a very short period of time, maybe just a couple of months. And then he starts writing for Arts magazine until 1965. So Judd is charged with seeing nearly every exhibition in New York, and it's a wide range of shows. He's incredibly attentive, he's observant, and he's keenly interested in not only looking, but really examining the artwork. And I think a lot of people are familiar with his style of writing, which I think is quite great, somewhat terse, but it's been described as him writing with the immediacy of a war correspondent and sending dispatches from the front lines. But the thing is like before he's even writing, he's at the Art Students League in 1948. He's likely seeing these exhibitions of Pollock, who showed at Parsons in 1948, 1950, 51. Later, Pollock is at Janus. Newman has his first show at Parsons in 1950. There's Ad Reinhardt who's showing there, Rothko, he also goes to Janus. And these are the artists that he comes to admire most. And just to put it in perspective, if he sees Pollock's show in 1948, he's born in 28, he's 20 years old. So Judd is looking at all of this art and he's writing these reviews and he's figuring out what he likes and what he dislikes, and he's finding some aspects of other artists' work that he's really drawn to, and then he sees those that he's not interested in at all, and he starts forming his own ideas about what he wants to bring to his own artwork. So who does he like? He likes John Wesley's paintings because they're flat and they negate any kind of cubist conception of illusionistic space. He likes John Chamberlain because of his use of color. He likes Yayoi Kusama because, like Pollock, her work covers the entire pictorial field, and that eliminates the problem of having something in front of the picture plane and the idea of how you have to deal with that figure-ground relationship. He likes Yves Klein for his color, but he's less enthusiastic about Klein's monochromatic paintings because he feels it lacks any kind of spatial quality. And all the while that he's looking at, as I said, he's looking at this work, he's figuring out and thinking about his own work. So while he's writing these reviews, he's really searching for his own original style that's isolated and unique, but also a product of contemporary developments. But it becomes clear that his criticism and his work are informing one another. His early work is figurative, and by the mid-1950s, he's working through academic modernism. And then in 1959, which is just when he's writing for Arts Magazine, it's at the exact same moment, he has this breakthrough into abstraction. In the 50s, he'd been trying to get away from making shapes. And with these works that are on view here now, he's trying to figure out how to put something on the canvas, yet avoid having it look composed. And it's through his writing that he's seeing how other artists are dealing with these similar problems and sources. So while he's absorbing what other artists are doing in their work, it's really important to understand that he's in no way copying or even emulating these other artists. What he's doing is he's taking what he likes in the work of these artists and trying to figure out a way to do it differently. And as he said, it took me a long time to figure it all out.
Thanks, Eileen. And I thank you for that overview of especially some of his critical interests while he's writing between 59 and 65. I'm interested, Marta, to hear some of your thoughts on Judd's philosophical studies. I know that that's something that's of interest to you, and you know, I'd love to think about the ways in which that might have informed what he's doing at this time, or if you could kind of maybe set a little bit of the groundwork for that.
Yeah, I think that the reticence that Judd sort of exhibits within his language and his writing isn't sort of a matter-of-factness. I think it has to deal with his interest in achieving this level of disinterestedness. And when I speak about that word disinterestedness, I speak about it and reference it in terms of its aesthetic significance, and in terms of like the Kantian idea of disinterestedness in thinking, in terms of a work of art and the experience of a work of art being something about contemplation, anticipation, and eventually emancipation. Uh-huh. And he dodges many questions about what is it exactly that you do? Is it sculpture? Is it painting? And he said it's actually neither. And he disassociates him, well, not disassociates it, but he sort of severs himself from everything prior and saying, I'm not in the lineage of abstract expressionism. I am entering into something which is about abstraction. And he sets that out very clearly in one of the very early notes that are in these two fabulous books, one interviews and one in writings, in note from 1963, where he is actually, and I'm keeping these books nearby me, where he says, the first thing to do is to dispel the reasonable expectation that the term abstract art has a definite meaning. And he says the term was fairly specific in the first decade or so of this century when abstraction began, but it has since become increasingly vague. And he is taking this word abstraction and removing it from the category of abstract expressionism. And in that sense, he returns back to his studies at Columbia in philosophy, but principally in aesthetics, where he's interested in American pragmatism. He's interested in Charles Sanders Peirce. He's interested in Peirce's laying out pragmatism in the idea of skepticism. He's interested in the ideas that mathematics serve as the very basis of abstraction. So he borrows from mathematics, but not in a literal sense. He borrows from the logic of mathematics. And this is interwoven throughout his texts. The fact that he references abstraction from the early century, in the early part of the 20th century, is the fact that he is referencing the abstraction that was employed by the Soviet constructivists. So that's what interests him, the idea of the line as a vectoral space, as a dimensional space.
And I'm curious to kind of go back to one of the first points that you made about a kind of disinterestedness. And it struck me thinking about specific objects. Judd's most famous essay, written in '64, published in '65, where he said a work needs only to be interesting. And of course that has gotten discussed a lot in Judd conversations, but I think I haven't quite heard this pivot between disinterestedness and what it is to be interested in, therefore. And I'm curious if you could say a little bit more about what you think Judd meant by a work needs only to be interesting, with that understanding that you brought in of disinterestedness at the beginning.
I believe that he's trying to say that in order to break through to something new, I mean, painting, for example, it wasn't dead. I mean, they speak about, they're asked, is painting dead, is painting not dead? And he's saying it's no longer sufficient. You know, I think Stella speaks about that in that first interview that seems canonical between Dan Flavin, Donald Judd, and Frank Stella, that is conducted by Glaser in '64. They are saying, you know, it's not a matter of it being dead, it's a matter that it no longer provides a sufficient language for us to proceed with. And so they're asked, what is it that you are actually trying to proceed with? And they're very vague about, you know, what they're trying to proceed with. And, you know, at that point, Judd says, I want my work to be as a distinct reaction to abstract expressionism. I look at it as a proposal which digs into the ground, which stood long before the turgid painting reiterated itself. And this idea of like digging into the ground, Judd says, and he just answers, root, hog, die, which is, you know, sort of like a technique of the pig going into the ground and finding some other way to survive through the ground. And for looking at these lines in these paintings, I can't see them just as lines. They're more diagrammatic paintings that set out for Judd the painting as a proposal, as a field of inquiry. And they have dimension, and they're even conduits, and they're divided up into sort of segments, as Peirce would say a line would be.
And I'd love to get into a little bit more of that formal kind of reading of these paintings here shortly. There's so many interesting things that were just said that I want to reflect on, because I do think it is important to understand the kind of discourse that was happening, even, you know, that was still happening in the mid-'60s about, is easel painting dead, which is one of the interviews, panel conversations that Judd participated in, and that had, I would imagine, been a conversation that had already been going on for a decade. So I'm curious to reflect a little on what Judd thinks he's doing, where he's moving, this root, hog, and die, within the context of him saying in a 1987 interview, I think the origin of my work does lie in painting. My work doesn't arise from sculpture. It comes out of the paintings of Pollock, Newman, and Rothko. And so we've already established, that this isn't imitation. This isn't attempting to root around in a tradition that has already maybe been dispelled by other artists. It's something else. But nevertheless, Judd saying that his work in 3 dimensions is not coming from the tradition of sculpture. Instead, it's coming out of painting. And then he specifically lists 3 painters, even though I think we'll add in a number like Malevich and Russian constructivists and Yves Klein, who I think are certainly relevant to this conversation. But I'd like to kind of address that particularity and maybe think about why a Pollock and a Newman why his painting was coming out of their work.
Sure. So Judd was deeply influenced by the abstract expressionists, especially Newman and Pollock, because for Judd, they represented a new type of painting. And while he greatly admired this achievement, he also felt that he needed to move beyond what they had accomplished. So one of the things that he likes about Newman's work, and that becomes important within Judd's object sculpture practice, is that there's no hierarchy of composition in a Newman painting, and there's no illusionism, and he's eliminated any sort of range of outside associations. He also felt that Pollock, Newman, Rothko, and I'll bring in Clifford Still, because Clifford Still looms large as well in a lot of his thoughts and writings at this time. But he said that these artists had made their work a reality and not a picture of it, and that's really important to him. It was critical to his own work. And he said, and this is a quote, "You can't look at the world, paint a picture of it, and claim reality." He's also captivated by Newman's involvement in issues of size and his concerns with problems of scale. And this was a major concern for Newman because he wanted his paintings to have a physical presence and for the viewer to have what I'll say is a kinesthetic experience. And this could be achieved through size and scale of his paintings. So let me explain what he's talking about. Size is physical measurement, and when he talks about scale, he's talking about the internal proportion within the work and the viewer's relationship to the canvas. So I think a way to explain this might be is that Newman was concerned with the way in which the viewer would mentally and physically process the phenomenon of space in the presence of his work. And I think that this is what Newman means when he talks about a painting creating a sense of place, a sense of being there. And this too is really important to Judd when he starts making his objects. I know he didn't like to call them sculpture, so maybe we could move on to the Newman painting, the Veer Heroicus, which is reference number 9, Veer Heroicus Sublimis, which dates from 1950 to 51. And so Judd's taken by Newman's flat surfaces of color, and it's often this intense color, which Judd feels, that he's drawn to intense color because he feels that it needs to be powerful. In Newman's work, he's also impressed with the minimum of gesture. And he said that Newman's brushwork simply indicates the process of making the work, and process is really important to Judd when he starts making his objects. He's taken by the directness of Newman's paintings, and this is the result of the way in which Newman is using paint as paint and color as color. As Judd said in writing about Newman's work, quote, "Red is just red paint. It's nothing more and doesn't pretend to be anything other than that." And so, that plays into this idea that he also liked how Newman allowed materials to retain what he regarded as their inherent properties. So when a critic asked Newman about some oil stains that appear along these 2 bands, yellow bands in one of his paintings, The Moment from 1962, Newman replied that this effect was part of what a painting or any oil painting was. I mean, that's what paint does. And we'll see that in some of Judd's works here. I mean, there's drips in some of the paintings, and they seem to be like just coming from nowhere, but the paint dripped while he was making the painting, and he's letting paint be paint. That's what paint does.
Yeah, and I'm curious to delve a little bit more into this inherent properties and the question of reality and not a picture of it, because those are have a lot of philosophical depth, right? Of like, what is the question of reality? What is the question of inherency in something, and the difference between what you observe and what is real in front of you? And I'm curious if we could linger a little bit on that, because I think it's quite, it seems on the one hand kind of easy to grasp, but I think it is a really radical shift in the history of painting that Newman's making, that other artists are like Pollock and Rothko are making, but that Judd really picks up on. So I'm wondering if we could say a little bit more about what an inherent property is in terms of the actual material, and what painting reality would be versus creating an illusion of it.
I think in order to unpack that, we have to look at Judd's understanding of real, what is real and what is real space. And he very much points that out in the 1964 essay of Specific Objects. He's saying, and I'm paraphrasing him in that he's wanting to address real space. So, okay, what is real space? And he's actually speaking about, it has nothing, and here he's quoting, new three-dimensional work as an category indicating neither physical presence nor a volumetric occupation of space, but with an obvious alternative that opens up to anything. And he says this is real space. It's something that gets rid of the problem of illusionism and of literal space, space in and around marks and colors. And in that sense, he is drawing from this idea of the fact that he's getting away from the contrivance or of pictorial composition. And the fact is that the way to do this is to head into three-dimensionality, to try to expose the individual, or what presence is, beyond the anthropocentric centered human being surrounded by four walls. It means that we have to look perspectively from aerial views, from perspectives that are outside of the human being. For example, there's the reference 12 of the painting, where the line actually at some point just disappears. And he makes very explicit the fact that he has just sort of made either an error or that it gets smudged out.
Right, there's maybe an erasure. In some ways, erasure shows what is real because you have the absence of it. And in some ways, that's also the use of real space and negative space, so on. It heightens your understanding of what the room that the object is taking up. And I mean, I'm obviously these things in terms of the move away from composition, and even this question of the aerial, it does make me think back on Pollock's work and on a painting like Autumn Rhythm, and what the kind of perspectival shift that Pollock's introducing there. And I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit about that to then move in again onto what Judd's doing in a painting like reference image 12.
Sure. So we're talking about like real space, and when in relationship to his sculpture, or objects, I just wanted to say that I think that one of Judd's greatest achievements in his work, and I'm talking about the objects, not really the paintings, is its ability to alter the relationship between the viewer and the object, and so that it shifts the meaning from the object as art to the specter's awareness of his or her perceptions as they move through space. And to me, that's what I think he means when he's talking about real space, when you have a Judd object on the floor and that the viewer can walk around it. And it's not so much about the art object anymore, but it's about the viewer's relationship to the work, and their own perceptions as they move through and in and around the object. And I think that this really comes out of Newman as well as Pollock.
Right, the phenomenological relationship,
Exactly.
as you've said,
Exactly.
of the relationship of your body in front of the question of size, a painting so large that it really has this enveloping quality, or it takes up the painting so large that it takes up a whole wall or becomes wall-like.
Right, exactly, that too.
I think what happens, perhaps what's different about Judd's kind of the subjective, the apprehending of the work is that it is no longer private, it's public. And he places this impulse about the civic that's kind of interwoven, that doesn't get placed next to the object, but it makes itself explicit through his investigations. He's interested in urban studies. In the writings book, you have a review of looking at Lee Bonteque, which is speaking about reliefs and the importance of something that would be more aligned with Nam Gabo and Pevsner. And those, prone sculptures from the early part of the century, together with speaking about Kansas City, and a visit to the Nelson Atkins Museum, but at the same time speaking about Kansas City in detail. And in that respect, he starts working with materials that are vernacular materials. He inserts, the line turns into an asphalt putt, and these paintings, in a way, become three-dimensional.
Right, and I think to add to some of this biographical context, certainly we know that, Judd was deeply interested and engaged in architecture, in creating not just the space of an installation, but in actually augmenting existing buildings to serve as domestic spaces and studios in which to install his work. And this was a long-standing interest. Judd had been in the Army Corps of Engineers, and this is something that is kind of also at the same time as he's developing his painting practice when he gets out of the Army in 47, and he kind of paints up until 61. But there is also, I think, undergirding his interest, this deep respect for and engagement with architecture, and in particular, both particular styles of architecture, but also in engineering. He writes an essay called 20th Century Engineering, where he's really kind of in awe of what engineers can do, and that is, I think, a slightly different twist to the abstract expressionist engagement with architecture. I think engineering is different than architecture. It's a different practice, and that's something that maybe in these kind of the line work that we see more of the undergirding or the structure or the diagram of what's involved in holding something together, like a building in some ways.
Well, you remind me of this quote. I can't remember when Judd said it, but it was much later on. And he said, most people, when they walk into a cathedral, they thank God, when really they should be thanking the architect. And you could also say the engineer as well.
Right.
But if I could just touch on for a moment this idea of him installing the art. I think his approach is different, and his reasoning is very different from what the abstract expressionists were doing. Sorry, I keep using that catch-all word. But it was an ideal for Pollock and Newman and Rothko to create an environment of their paintings where one would walk in and just be totally enveloped by it. And Rothko is really the only one of the abstract expressionist artists who's able to achieve that, and that's in the Rothko Chapel. And when you go into the Rothko Chapel, I would propose that, his paintings almost eclipse the architecture. They become the architecture. They're almost wall-like. You cannot look into that Rothko painting. There's like an opacity. There's nowhere for the eye to travel. And I think with Judd, it's my understanding that his hope in installing his works was really for preservation. You just felt like you send your paintings out into the world on exhibition and they get so beat up, and
Yeah, you send. I mean, especially. I mean, when he's exhibiting these objects and people are confused by their material features, that they have not, encountered works made from, stainless steel or galvanized iron in particular. They're just getting kind of thrown onto trucks, and it's kind of out of that experience of a fairly careless attitude towards the works that. And their installation, that he starts developing this spatial practice. But I do think it's intertwined with a deep understanding and reverence for the built environment and how it is a whole. And in some ways, he is trying to create a whole.
I think we can't separate the fact that, Judd is developing this discussion and elaborating at a time of crisis in urbanism in the United States. I mean, you have a lot of critique of Corbusier. He's dismantled from the CAM by a group of young architects from London. Humanism is inserting itself as an impulse in the late 50s. We're not quite, I mean, the countercultural movement happens in the 50s. It doesn't happen in the 60s. Its manifestation is in the 60s. And he's in New York, where individuals are interested in this. And they're, he's getting involved with a community of dancers. And so this, the idea of a civic responsibility enters into his work. He's not separated from that. He's living amongst people that are practicing and trying to find a new vocabulary.
Right. And I'm interested in here kind of blending that point with one that was made earlier in looking at Note 1963 and this distinction between abstraction and abstract expressionism. Abstract expressionism being, a category, and abstraction having more to do, perhaps, with a way of behaving or living that can be physical. And I just want to. I think it's important enough that I do want to just read a little bit more from what Marta had introduced earlier in this note in 1963, where Judd says, "It is also unfortunate that schools and universities, if not more backward, teach abstract expressionism as if it were a style, the dogma of a civilization. They are often as narrow as those who insisted on copies from classical plaster casts. Learning abstract expressionism is as useless. It is too late. The dogmatism is a denial of the freedom which Pollock and Rothko and the others had or have. Abstraction is not any given technique. Techniques are invented together with purposes. Separate techniques are useless. A primary thing about abstraction is that it is open and changeable." And I'd love to linger here on the kind of radical political element of that, the dogmatism of these kind of easily digestible categories, and then that gets taught and repeated instead of creating, what he considered an open situation for the arts, which is where he knew Pollock and Rothko and Newman had been trying to come from or break out of, and that's quite hard to challenge. The tradition that you're coming from, but that kind of freedom that's open and changeable seems to be really essential to making anything new and inventive, and as he says, that something that has a purpose. And so I'm interested from a aesthetic position, kind of what we think these purposes might be. I mean, I think we'll look a little bit more at some of the techniques in the paintings, but I'd like to maybe set the ground for what the purpose Judd has in abstraction more, and utilizing abstraction more than in referencing abstract expressionism. Does that make sense?
Well, he speaks a lot about the negative approach to space, and he distinguishes positive approach as progress, and that progress is not something that we should be actually centered about, that we should actually be looking at dismantling our kind of constructed environment and getting down to the very primary elements. And in order to do that, we need to sort of adopt, and I guess he then resorts, or perhaps my supposition is that he references back to his aesthetic studies about that point in the Kantian notion of the sublime, where you're just faced with either a mathematical significance of the horizon or a horizon as an imagination, and where you are left completely naive in forming categories, and that we in some way have to return back to that very kind of blank slate of disinterestedness. And to do that, we need to get back to like primary, materials, but also look at the materials of our lives and of our built environment.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting, because I think, Newman is perhaps a strange character in that he has this interest in the sublime, but he also has this political sensibility that I imagine that Judd was interested in and engaged in as well, and also a writer.
Yes, absolutely.
And so I'm wondering what you think from that perspective of maybe not from the element of Newman's interest in the sublime, but from other areas of his interest in the real or the lived experience that you think that Judd might have been drawing from.
Well, if you don't mind, I just want to go back for 1 second to when we were talking about the installation of the paintings.
Please.
And again, because these paintings were so unfamiliar to me, and what I learned is that Judd only really installed the works that were important to him and that he wanted to look at, and he installed the paintings in Marfa, in the Cobb House. So. I just wanted to point that out, that this work was important to him.
Yeah, I mean, so for someone who, just to say
to
say a little bit more on that, I mean, Judd, even though he moves away from painting after 61, starts to develop reliefs and then the work in 3 dimensions. In the early 90s, he installs a number of his paintings, not only from this time period of 59 to 61, but also even earlier paintings between 56 and 58. And that's always, to be honest, been quite curious to me, because at least in terms of the narrative that we hear about Judd, that there is this radical break, right? And certainly there was one into working in 3 dimensions. But I think to then have this return and this reflection on these paintings as part of perhaps a way of exposing one's thinking and one's own development and the individual development, rather than trying to force together the development of a Pollock and a Newman and so on, these kinds of like creating an abstract expressionist room. He's really, I think maybe feels like he can only historicize himself and his own work, because he's the only one who really understands where he was coming from and that development. But I still find it quite curious to see those paintings from the mid-50s, to be honest. It's interesting.
Well, he may wanted to install a room of abstract expressionist works, but he would never call it abstract expressionism. I mean, I think I'm kind of going back to the other idea of what we were talking about with the abstract expressionism, and what his problem with it was he just felt it was so monolithic, and there were so many diverse artists, and you've got Pollock and Newman, but de Kooning didn't really fit in for him. De Kooning was just, he was bringing in figuration. Again, another thing that I like about his writing is he makes these pronouncements, and he just has and no problem saying that, for example, and he said this at Franz Klein, he just thought he wasn't good enough, to be considered part of the abstract expressionists. So, the work there's obviously commonalities, but it's also very diverse. And then you were asking about Newman and Judd, and it's interesting to me in that they are both writing letters to the editor, they're writing essays, they're writing articles. There's like a lot of shared similarities there too.
Certainly. And
beyond the work.
Beyond just the work, certainly.
It's interesting because he does revisit he starts to reflect back on his historical work. And he writes in 1981, Russian art in regard to myself.
Right.
So he's like looking at, and he's like, why, when I began going to art school in 1948, the school was so mediocre that it was possible to be self-educated in it. The only school that I know of now that was probably good was Black Mountain, where Albers taught, and then later Yale University, where he went there. No one mentioned Malevich in the school that I was in, and I think there were only 5 paintings by him in the Museum of Modern Art. And it's an essay that explores why Malevich was important, and he speaks about the fact that it is achieving the non-objective, the consciousness as the present, consciousness as non-objective. And something that perhaps, he says later in this essay, and forgive me for quoting further, I wrote once that Malevich painted as if he's busy, that there's a matter-of-fact quality to the execution. And certainly the very direct placements of the squares and bars have an empirical quality to them. The busy range of his interests, political posters, stage sets, teaching, and architecture, seems fairly pragmatic. And so he becomes very interested in being struck by the fact that, why didn't I know about this artist? And so in a way, perhaps the reflection back on his paintings is looking at them as a working through in order to arrive where he was so that he could go back to painting again and to find it as a relevant category and to say, yes, no, it is not sculpture, it is actually the traditional painting.
Right, and I'd like to take that as a wonderful segue into looking more closely at some of the paintings. And I'm wondering, in this exhibition of 15 paintings, if there are some that we could look more closely at that you found particularly curious or engaging, or that you felt like really demonstrated kind of what Judd said were his interests and problems in painting. And I know, Marta, we had talked a little bit about the gray painting. I'm wondering if we want to look at that painting a little bit more, and you can articulate your thinking about what's going on with the line in that painting.
Yeah, sure, we can. We're looking at it.
Yes, it's reference image 12 for the audience.
We're dealing with the imaginary here and referencing. Again, it seems to be the one unique time where he breaks with following, with the continuum in the line. And it seems to be that in this respect, he's looking at the line from different perspectives. He's also thinking of it as a vanishing horizon at some point, where sort of the line would dissipate. But it's something that is it's not necessarily about vector and force, but it has dimensionality to it. It has dimension, and it is not a thread. It can be broken apart. And in this case, he is thinking, how can we take something like this, the basic element of drawing, and think of it in a spatial and a temporal way, in a spatial and temporal paradigm.
Right.
And to explore that by repeating and following this. So in some way, it's not only the line, it's an edge.
Right.
And so we look at it as sort of like a highway or some kind of pathway. But I think he's sort of exploring, how do I take this and explore my ideas about the third dimension.
Right, and how to do it in a way that's non-compositional, which I think is really challenging. I wonder if we'd like to look briefly at reference image 13, which it involves the first painting that we looked at that Eileen Miles discussed, but also another painting from 1961 that has this deep blue background and then a white line that bisects. And I mean, a couple things come to my mind here, but I'd love to hear Eileen, your thoughts on this in relationship to a kind of Newman-like zip.
Right. Isn't it? It's Alex Kitnick, I think, in his essay in the Miami catalog. It was just the only catalog
2018
on paintings that I know of, and he says that Judd is taking Newman's line for a walk. It's just so funny.
Yeah, I really enjoy that.
What's interesting to me is like, in all of these paintings, his use of line is so idiosyncratic. In every work. It is so different. And that's one of the things that I really love about these paintings, is that they're very adventurous and they're experimental. And, he's trying to figure things out. He likes line, I think, because line it can sort of accentuate the flatness of the picture plane. And again, he's against this optical illusion. And, I don't know how successful he is in these paintings with that notion, but, he's still trying to work it out. I still see a little bit of figure ground play here with these works with the line. But, this is what I really like. This is what Judd said about line in regard to Joseph Stella's work, and I think it really is appropriate to the line that he uses in these paintings. But he says, a line can be used to describe an object, yet, and this is the good part, he says it also exists independently as a vivifying electric element. And I think that is what happens in these paintings. It really invigorates them.
And I see that we are kind of approaching the close of this conversation, which is so surprising to me because there's so many things that could be said about these paintings. And I do deeply encourage everyone who can to come to see the exhibition at Gagosian, because there are very few instances in which one can see these paintings. And I think they are extremely beautiful and curious. And I'm curious if there are any kind of last words on these paintings from either of you, Marta or Eileen, or something that that struck you as the most interesting or curious.
I have something. Do you want to go first? Because I just spoke. Okay.
Please.
So when I first saw these paintings, I had to engage in this exercise, like what would I think of these paintings if I didn't know that they were by Donald Judd? And, and I liked them. And my first thought, actually, when I saw them is that I found them compelling. That was my first thought. I thought these works are so compelling. And it was kind of reassuring when, I guess, Richard Schiff, it's a new book that he has out on Judd's essay.
A collection of his writings on
and he
Judd.
says in the introduction to this book, he says that when he first saw Judd's work in the mid-1960s, and this is the objects, the exact same thing, he says, quote, Judd's art compelled my attention. And then he goes on to say that compelled is the right word. He said, Judd's art affects me by occupying the totality of my sensations. And then he goes on and he brings in Peirce, which I'm not going to get into. I'll leave that for you.
For another conversation.
That's my take on the work.
Being compelled by the paintings. Mm-hmm. Well, thank you both for your time this evening. It's been a really pleasurable conversation.
Thank you,
very enjoyable.
It's been great.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And thank you, Marta, Eileen, and Caitlin for this wonderful talk. And thank you all so much for joining us digitally. And we hope you'll all come and visit the exhibition in person. It's Donald Judd Paintings, 1959 to 1961, at Gagosian, 555 West 24th Street in New York. Thank you.